Hello and welcome to Full Contact Nerd. I'm Cris Alvarez and thank you for listening. I'm speaking with Brian Herskowitz, author of Process to Product, From Concept to Script, a practical guide for the screenwriter. So this is part 2 of our discussion on the subject, on writing screenplays, and we'll be discussing a structure.
Yeah.
All right, so thanks for speaking with me.
My pleasure.
And all right, so let's kick it off. Tell me about structure.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that most professional writers understand is that structure is story. Mm-hmm. And without some sort of structure, you don't have any way of kind of following the path that you need to get to. And it's sort of like if you had plotted out a trip from LA to New York, but you didn't have a map and you didn't have a GPS and you just knew you had to get on some road somewhere. Chances are you're going to get lost, as opposed to, I know I'm going to stop in Sacramento, then I'm going to go east over to, Colorado, and then from Colorado, etc. So that you have a plan in mind. I sometimes like to think of it as, when you're building a house, if you're an architect, you don't just get a piece of land and somebody says, okay, build something. You just have to have an idea of where you're going and how you're going to get there. So structure is what contains your story. And there are a lot of different theories and ideas about what is proper screenplay structure. Going back, the original kind of go-to was the 3-act structure, which was taught by Sid Field. Mm-hmm. And the idea that, every story, and I still believe this is true, every story has a beginning, middle, and end. And when you think of that as your structure, you're going to have a beginning, you're going to have a middle, you're going to have an end, no matter which order those come in. Mm-hmm. So if you have for example, a Quentin Tarantino type film, mm-hmm. where it jumps around in time, there's still the beginning that the audience experiences, the middle the audience experiences, and the end the audience experiences. And within each story, that whether it goes backwards and forwards, there's still the beginning, the middle, and the end. For instance, if you look at Kill Bill 1 and 2, you have a character in that story that travels back and forth through time. So the first time we see her, she's getting beaten up at her wedding. And then the next time we see her, she's driving to get revenge. And then it goes back to the hospital and how she recovered. But we still know that if you were to look at the story in terms of what happened to this woman, you know that the story goes from she left Bill to marry this guy, she was pregnant, they came to wreak havoc on her and her wedding party, they killed everybody, thought they had killed her, she had gone to the hospital, and when she came out and started to recover, she had one ideal in mind, and that was to go kill Bill, which is the title of the story. Mm-hmm. And the whole 2-film arc is her journey, how she gets revenge on all the people that wronged her, and how she eventually faces off with Bill. No matter how they went back and forth in time, it is still a beginning, a middle, and an end. Mm-hmm. So there are 2 different kinds of structure. There's the story structure, which must have a beginning, middle, and end. And in my opinion, you can look at the microcosm of any story, and you'll find that that's true. Even a joke. A joke has the beginning, which is the setup. Then it has the middle, which is where you tell what's going to happen. And then the payoff, which is the end. Mm-hmm. So everything that you tell someone in a story confinement has some structure that encapsulates in some way the beginning, middle, and end.
Mm-hmm. And so I'll give an example of a mistake maybe to mm-hmm. try to figure out what exactly would be the beginning. So I'm aware that oftentimes people will try to write a bunch of backstory. Like they won't get into the beginning. They'll kind of form the world and the setting, and that's their beginning, but it doesn't work, I think.
Right. It varies. But, it sort of depends on how you actually illustrate that. So I'll give you a quick example. When you start to build any story, one of the questions you want to ask yourself is, how close to the end can I start? So the more you compress time, the more you're going to involve the audience in action. But that doesn't mean you can't have a story that is epic and goes over years or millennia or whatever. And a great example of that is if you look at the film Gandhi, which was a Academy Award-winning film. They could have started that film at a lot of different places. Where they began it is when Gandhi was a young lawyer coming back from being educated in England, comes back to India, and then from there starts his career. And we learn about his life, and then he becomes a holy man and a teacher and on, right? That's a huge epic film that I think spans 60 years, 70 years. But they could have started with his birth, or they could have started with his parents, or they could have started when he was a child, or they could have started when he actually, made his transition into a holy man. They made a decision that this was where they wanted to begin the story, and they felt like that illustrated why he got to his choice of becoming a pacifist, of believing in independence for India. So it really varies. The one thing I will say you always want to do is start your story as close to the end as you can. But if you're telling a life, if you're telling a big story, you may have to go back. You may have to do something that, starts early on and then goes from there. The Curious Case of Benjamin Button is another film that starts with the birth of Benjamin Button and then goes through to his death. So it's rather epic in scope. But the story is about someone who basically lives backwards in time, who is an old man when he's young and then becomes a child as he grows older. And, if you look at that, you go, okay, that I have to follow that beginning, middle, and end from these two bookends, because that's the journey that we want to take with that character.
So it sounds like, and this sort of goes back to the previous episode about premise, that the beginning, middle, and an end have to connect. Like they have to be sort of a unified structure.
Boy, they sure should be. There are certainly films where you watch it and you go, I don't know what's going on or where we are in space and time. And those are not generally very popular films. When people think about, hey, I want to hear a good story, or I want to read a good book, or I want to watch a good television show or a good movie, there's usually, one driving force, one element that we follow, that we want to kind of watch, unfold. And, if you were a fan of Game of Thrones, Game of Thrones was an awful lot about, politics and power and sex and all kinds of stuff. But ultimately, you knew that the story began and ends with the White Walkers. And it had to make that journey in order to determine who was going to sit on the Iron Throne. And that was the story, and that was the driving force that began in the very first episode, and then it kind of disappeared for a while, and then slowly it was, sprinkled in throughout the entire series until it came back. And we had to find out what happened. I hope I didn't give any spoilers. Did I just ruin Game of Thrones for people?
I don't think so. I doubt it.
Okay, good. But it really, that's one of the things that a writer has. I often think about, a writer has a million different colors that they can paint with, and they have to determine what are the hues and the tones and the colors that they want to start with. Are they doing broad strokes and primary colors? Are they being nuanced? And it's the same with the writing. So, if you're doing a big action piece, we don't really get too far into the psychology in Fast and Furious 5. We're not really thinking about, how these kids grew up and became drivers or why they became the people they became. We really want to see car crashes, people get into fights, get out of tough situations. And that's the most important element of that type of film. So, conversely, if you look at something like Parasite, which was, the best Academy Award winning film, was it last year, I think? Which is interesting to see. It's not the first time, but it's rare that a foreign film wins Best Picture. And that was really a very kind of intimate psychological thriller that took place in, this home with a kind of a upstairs, downstairs quality, and the gulf between the rich and the poor. So that's the kind of stuff that, you have to decide, which you're right. It goes back to your premise. What is the story you want to tell in a nutshell? That's going to give you kind of your clothesline on which to hang the garments that are your story.
I'm speaking with Brian Herskowitz, author of Process to Product. You can find more information on his website, brianherskowitz.com. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or chrisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. You'll also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at militaryhistorypodcast.com and technologyandspace.com. Now back to the podcast. To look at the concept, I think it's in novels they talk about, or maybe movies as well. You have your A plot and your B plot. Or let's say your tangential stories that are going along with the main story. How does that fit in with the structure?
Well, there's a couple of different things. In television, that structure has to hold. In film, you can just have an A story. You don't necessarily have to have some subplot. There's got to be other things that happen, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's other stories that you're going to follow and then are going to tie up. When a character goes on a journey in a film, oftentimes we follow that one character on whatever journey they're on, and we stay with that character. So, again, when, you look at the bigger action pieces and, you take a James Bond film, there may be a minor subplot of his romance with a woman who was the femme fatale that has turned good. And that, of course, is the woman that's going to be taken by the bad guy at the end that he's got to save. That's kind of the cliche Bond film. But really, it's just that one story. There's somebody evil. He's got to go find them. He's got to overcome them. He's got to beat them at the end. He has to do it with split-second timing at the very end of the story. So in film, it's less crucial that you have that B storyline that helps you drive. In television, you almost always do, partly because if you think about it, and this is more true now than it was, even 5 years ago. Television now, your series are more like very long movies or a series of movies. It's one story that's told through time and space, but it expands over a lot of area. So when you have something like Game of Thrones, you do take the time to have other storylines that you follow with other characters and subplot characters and, intrigue. In film, you do less of that. And a lot of it has to do, again, with what is your concept? What is the story you want to tell? If you do that, and you can absolutely, if you do have an A and a B storyline, if you do have a subplot that you want to talk about, whether it's a romantic subplot or it's, comedic relief, the one thing that I really recommend is that your subplot have some thematic resonance for your theme and your concept, so that there's something going on that is still a part of the fabric of the story. And an example would be Avatar. And so Avatar, the main story is of that the main character has taken on, he's a quadriplegic who has taken on this magnificent body and this 7-foot-tall blue creature. That's really the main story. That's the story we're most interested in. That's the story we want to learn about. But there is a big subplot which is about the kind of exploitation of the native people and the native resources. So in a way, it's about American imperialism, and it's about how, it's really kind of a metaphor for what happened in our country with the Native Americans when we first landed here. And that subplot is intimately tied with the main plot, because without that, you wouldn't have the main plot. And without that, you wouldn't have the ending. You would just simply have a guy who goes to a planet, has this avatar for some reason, meets this woman, they fall in love, and that's it. And that wouldn't be nearly as interesting, because in that story, although there is an inherent conflict between the fish out of water, the avatar who comes into this community that he doesn't initially understand and believes them all to be savages, and this kind of, imperialistic, militaristic force that's coming in and looking for the resources that these people have. That adds another level of conflict, and it heightens everything that happens in the story.
Would you say that, to get sort of more into details, does the beginning, middle, and end have, within each of those, do they have their own beginning, middle, and I'll use the word transition for end to the next?
I kind of look at every piece of a story as a microcosm of the whole. So, not only do you have, like sequences within a beginning, middle, and end, but within those sequences you have scenes, and they also have their structure, and then you have dialogue within the scene, and lines have structure. So everything has a structure of some sort. It's not, you don't really want to have too much weight on those kind of things. You want to learn it and then forget it, because you don't want it to become all technique. You want it to be natural. You want it to flow. You want it to come from a place of that's visceral and not just technical, just not your skill and your craft. So but you do want to understand that, I'm building a sequence I'm building a scene that's going to build sequences. I'm going to build those sequences that are going to build acts. I'm going to build those acts that are going to build the story. And you'll hear people talk about a 5-act story. You'll hear people talk about, movies of the week used to have 7-act stories. But the fact of the matter is, no matter how you chop up your acts, there's a beginning, middle, and end. There may be more. There may be, other steps and other, as you said, transitions. And those really revolve around major changes in the story. And it can be anything from the addition of a character who is either an ally or an opponent. It could be a physical task. It could be, something that they're attempting to do that they hit a brick wall. If you look at any of the ocean movies, the Ocean, 8 and Ocean 11, those films, they're always, it's the same formula. They come, they're going to try and rob a casino or a bank or whatever they want to rob, and they're going to, set out to do that. And of course, there's impossible odds. And the fun in watching those films is they're gathering their resources, their training in order to beat the system. And we want to see how they're going to do it. It's just, it's absolutely feels impossible for them to succeed, and they do. And those are the stories that, I think you have a feel-good story when you have that kind of outcome where you end up with something that, you're rooting for your hero, you're rooting for your main character or main characters to succeed, and they succeed, and, that's the elation that comes from watching that kind of story. So, there are a lot of things that I really suggest that young writers or new writers look at in terms of how to learn structure. And one is, do look at Sid Field. Learn about the 3-act structure, and then kind of put it aside. And then there's also, and I'm sure you've heard about Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces and the hero's journey. And that's another kind of, more of a mythic, main character driven story. The structure that follows one singular hero as he goes on his journey to bring back a boon. And of course, famously, Star Wars used that structure for its film. And it's Campbell came up with the thing he called the monomyth, which was basically, he looked at mythology around the world, and he was a professor of religion and mythology. And he looked at mythology around the world and the stories of heroes from Grendel on, and he kind of determined that there was really just one story that was told over and over and over again. They all had the same elements, but maybe in slightly different order, or they came at a different time, but they all had this kind of structure where there's a character who wants to get involved, doesn't want to get involved, gets kind of called into duty, goes on a quest to bring back a boon to society. On the way, he meets allies and enemies and opponents, finds a wise man who gives him advice, faces death in the belly of the beast, and then eventually is returned home triumphant after a big battle. So that was exactly what was used for Star Wars, and that started a new trend in storytelling. Now, and I think part of this is the advent of television really competing with feature films. Movies either have to take us either into ourselves or out of ourselves. And the smaller films, the more personal films, take us into ourselves, make us look at what is the human condition. And the bigger films, like whether they're the Marvel movies, that universe, they tend to be the outside, the elation, the fantasies, the things that we want to see and imagine could be real. We'd love to have superpowers. We'd love to be able to do what these people can do. I think Marvel has turned out some of the best movies the last decade, maybe 2 decades. And a lot of that comes from, not only are the films all terrifically structured, but they also find a way to make them personal, so that the characters have clear motivation and they are not perfect characters. They're flawed. So, Tony Stark is not, an absolutely perfect human being. He has his failings, and those come back to haunt him at different times. Each one of them has that.
Where would you say, so with your students, where would you say you found that people have the most difficulty with handling structure? Where do you see the most, I don't want to say problems, because you never know, but where do people struggle with?
It's usually in the middle. People usually have a very clear idea of what they want to start with. And they usually have a really clear idea on how they want their movie to end. Even if they don't know whether it's, he lives or dies, they know that there's going to come that choice at the end. It's the middle, because the middle has to drive the story. And that becomes difficult if you don't know what is it that makes people want to watch, and what is it that makes people push to the next moment, want to see what happens next. And there's ways of kind of coaxing that out of a writer, but it is some of the most difficult part. And what happens is young writers, and this is a big failing in my opinion in general for any writer, they become repetitious. So they kind of have the same beat over and over again, and it doesn't escalate. So there are 2 elements in any structure that I think help drive the second act, the middle of the film. And one is that the pressure on the main character continues to escalate, and the stakes continue to rise. So, if you start off with a character, facing life or death, you've got to come to a place that's higher than that at the end. And you have to have a character that's under some sort of pressure to perform, pressure to succeed, pressure to get the money, pressure to get the girl. That's why often in films they'll put a ticking clock. We have to do this by this time or else. One film that is a little more interpersonal that I break down in my book is Silver Linings Playbook. And I broke that down because it follows a very, I think, traditional structure, but it's not a particularly traditional film. It's serial comic. It's mostly interpersonal. There's not a whole lot of action. So how did they drive that script? Well, one of the things they did is it is a love story in the truest sense. And what I mean by that is, in a love story, the characters that you want to fall in love initially are in opposition. And it becomes the game of how are they going to win each other's hearts? How are they going to fall in love when they are at odds at this point? And that's a film that did that brilliantly. They started off with Jennifer Lawrence's character, not liking the guy in it. they don't get along at all. And he comes to her, knows that she can dance. He comes to her and says, I want to enter this dance competition. And his reason for that is he wants to get his ex-wife back. So there's another interesting thing that I play with in the book that I feel also assists you in building conflict and obstacles for your story and putting them into your structure. And that is that every character wants something. And, as I said before, there's the big want, the external want. I want to get my ex-wife back. Mm-hmm. And then there's that immediate want. I want to win this dance competition. So that happens. The immediate want tends to change, but the overall want doesn't, until we get to a character's moment of revelation where they go, oh crap, I'm in love with this girl. And there's an interesting dichotomy that goes along with that. And that is, if I am in love with her, I lose what I want. So one of the things that really helps is you give a character who's driving the story a hugely strong desire. I want this with all my heart. And then you give them an equally strong need that is in opposition to that. That if I get the need, the thing that I really truly need, then I lose what I want. So he had this very superficial relationship with his ex-wife, and that's what he wanted. He needed this deep relationship with Jennifer Lawrence's character. Mm-hmm. And at the end of the film, he has to make a choice. And you'll see that over and over and over again in love stories. In Shrek, which is a love story, you see it there. And you pick a love story, and it's got that structure in it. It's got that problem. And we as the audience want to see, how are these two going to get together?
Princess Bride, that's the one that.
Princess Bride is another one for sure. When they first meet, he's a stable boy and she treats him horribly, and then of course the problems become, once he's become the Dread Pirate Roberts. Initially, when he kidnaps her, he's acting as if they will never get together, that he's there to punish her because she had abandoned Wesley. Mm-hmm. And then of course it turns out that he is Wesley. So that's all part and parcel of that love story. But that's also an adventure story, and it does have subplots, and it has other characters that have also very strong desires. So Inigo Montoya desperately wants to find the man who killed his father, the six-fingered man, and that's what drives his story. And then the intersection of that is he needs the man in black, Wesley, in order to defeat the 50 guards that are in front of the castle and be able to get to Count, I think, Rugen, and defeat him and get revenge for his father's death.
So I don't want to get into outline at all, or get into that territory, because that's for another talk. So when I ask these questions, I'm trying to avoid outline and stick to structure.
Sure.
So the idea I get, or I've heard, is that the beginning is where you introduce all your characters and sort of the situation and the conflict. The middle is where you go through all the different beats and you progress through your adventure. And then the ending is where, there's no more of the raising you can still raise stakes and make it difficult, but it's basically you're at the end where it's the final battle or the final,
That's accurate. And there are stories that are ensemble pieces where you have multiple characters and multiple storylines, and you can look at films like Traffic and Babel, but they each have their own structure. So I think it was Babel that followed the path of a gun as it went from one hand to another and eventually ends up in the Middle East. And we get to know each person who watches and holds this gun at a different point in time. And it really is a very interesting and complex political piece. But whether the writer knows it or not, they have a structure for each of those characters, and there's one character that has a drive and a desire in each of those storylines. And if you don't have a drive for your characters in a B or C or D storyline when you're putting together an ensemble film, or then you're probably doing your audience a disservice, and they may lose interest. Because if they don't have something they're going after, we have a hard time getting involved with them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's where you'll sometimes hear someone say, "Oh, that part of the movie was boring," because it really, it was cute or whatever, but it really didn't mesh with the rest of what was going on.
And you often hear people say, "Oh, nothing happened." I was waiting for something to happen, and nothing happened, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that's, again, because it's really just the same thing happening over and over. So the two things that you want to look at is, how do I increase the stakes? How do I increase the pressure on the character? And then what is their motivation? What is their drive? And how important it is? And that goes back to the stakes. You want something that is crucially important to them. And if it's not, why do we care that they get it?
Mm-hmm. I'm speaking with Brian Herskowitz, author of Process to Product. You can find more information on his website, brianherskowitz.com. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, so far, please subscribe to it and rate it if you can. Please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or chrisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. You'll also find written interviews and my social media links there. You can find the links to my other podcasts at militaryhistorypodcast.com and technologyandspace.com. Now back to the podcast. So someone might ask, okay, so would this equally apply to, say, a comedy? Does comedy really have a 3-act structure or any kind of genre? Someone might question, does this really apply to every type of movie?
The answer is there's probably some films out there that don't follow that structure, but the majority of them do. And here's my advice: if you're a writer starting out, learn the form, learn the function, learn the craft, and then if you find some new way of creating a structure that doesn't do that, doesn't follow a beginning, middle, and end, go for it. And like I said, Tarantino, he shook up the status quo by going, I'm going to start in the middle, I'm going to go back to the beginning, and he did that not just in Kill Bill, but he did in Pulp Fiction. He likes to play with time, and he likes to play with space, and that's a very interesting device. But it's still a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end for each. And if you look at Pulp Fiction, where there are several different storylines that we follow, we follow the two assassins, as they try to navigate their lives from the time that they pick up this guy who's a drug dealer and he accidentally gets his head blown off to, they're cleaning it up, and then they're supposed to kill Bruce Willis and they blow that, and then they're having breakfast at this diner where, we've got two characters that are going to try and rob them come up. And these, all of these pieces, they're of a story. They're one piece. And one of the things that I think Tarantino does really brilliantly is the way that he weaves the story and makes them feel all part of the same fabric. And you never feel like in a Tarantino film, or rarely feel like, anything is unimportant. That story didn't really matter, or why am I watching that, or what does that have to do with the price of tea? It just doesn't. You don't get that feeling. And sometimes you do in a film where it tries to break the structure. I gave you a totally different example of a film that did try to break away from structure. It was called I'm Not Here. Do you know that film?
No, I don't.
Okay. So that there's a reason for that, Chris. There's a reason you don't know that film. And it was a big movie. It was basically a fictionalized biography of Bob Dylan. And what they did is they had, I think it's 5 different stories, 6 different stories, something like that. There are 5 or 6 different stories that all have Bob Dylan as a main character. And in each one of the stories, they have a different actor playing Bob Dylan, including a woman at one point. And, you get the idea that the concept, and this is going back to the idea of theme and concept. The concept was, he's a complex person, and we're going to show very different aspects of his character. And they had fantastic actors. Cate Blanchett is the one, I think, who played him as a woman. Cross-dressed, played a man, and played Dylan. And there were some really, really outstanding actors in it. But ultimately, you kind of left the theater going, I don't know what I saw. I don't really understand, what the story was about. I don't leave feeling like I really know anything more about Bob Dylan. I don't really get any insight to who he is. And maybe that's the point. He's enigmatic, and maybe the point is, because he's such an enigma, we're going to make a film that's also enigmatic. But the problem is, it's not a popular film. People are not, going out in droves to watch that movie. And when I talk to my students about this, I say, you have the right, and you have, permission from anybody, me included, to go and do whatever story in whatever way you want. But you got to think of it, and I use kind of a baseball analogy, that, if you're hitting to the corners, and you're doing something unique, you may have a little bit better chance of hitting a home run, but you also have a better chance of being out, of hitting a foul ball. And if you're hitting something straight down the middle, and it goes through, you've got a pretty good chance of getting on base. So that's structure to me. When we have structure and we have that's straight down the middle, and the more you adhere to that, the more narrow that lane is, the broader the audience. When you start getting into the really different structures and odd structures and films that, are following different characters around and then, coming through who knows what to get us to something, you ultimately, you lose a lot of people. There are those people that love those kind of films, that will seek that kind of film out. And if you understand that as a filmmaker and you go, that's the kind of story I want to do. If you're somebody who likes to write, like, there's a film called The Lobster. Are you familiar with that film?
That sounds familiar.
Okay, so The Lobster is Colin Farrell stars in The Lobster, and it's not a futuristic society. It is I guess you'd call it magic realism, where it's a parallel universe. And in this universe, you must have a mate. You have to have somebody that is your mate. And if you don't, the forces that control things, they don't really describe or explain who this is, turn you into an animal. But you get to choose your animal. And Colin Farrell's brother becomes a dog. And at the beginning of the film, he tells the people that take him in to try and find a mate that he wants to become a lobster. And they talk about, why do you want to be a lobster? And, he talks about, well, you got your shell. And, I didn't stick with me, that part. But he goes through and he tries to find a mate. And the criteria for a mate in this world, this universe, is you have to have something in common. And they make it pretty broad. But he ends up being kind of a misfit in this universe, not wanting to stay, not wanting to be with the people that he thinks he's going to woo. And he only has a certain period of time before they're going to capture him. They make him turn into an animal. So he escapes, and there's a resistance, and he meets this resistance, and he falls in love. In the resistance, love is outlawed. So they're rebellious against the establishment, which says there's love. So anyway, the bottom line, it's an unknowable film for me. It was one of those films where I just went, I don't know. I know people that watched it and went, I love that movie. Oh, it was so, so quirky and fun. And I walked out going, that's 2 hours of my life I just can't get back. It wasn't my kind of thing, but there were people that do. And you, as an artist, have every right to do that kind of story where it can be, interpersonal or odd or, it doesn't matter. And if you are bound and determined to do that, great. But you got to know that you're aiming towards corners. You got a good shot of going foul. And if you go foul, no bueno. The opposite of that, somebody that, also I think tends to play with structure to a greater or lesser degree, is Charlie Kaufman, who wrote Being John Malkovich. He wrote, what else did he? And he did the story of Chuck Barris. He did the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. Mm-hmm. So he's got a very quirky sense of story, very interesting. Mm-hmm. And he actually talked about structure in classes, and he was kind of anti-film class. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons was he had this idea for Being John Malkovich, and a teacher told him, that's insane, don't do it. And he went, well, I don't want to hear that. I want to make this movie. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a script that was very, very odd and quirky and fun, but worked. Mm-hmm. And it worked again because it had a structure. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that, great storytellers, some of them just have that in them. Stephen King is somebody who just has the ability to tell a great story, mm-hmm. and didn't necessarily, have to study that. It was just in him. Mm-hmm. William Goldman, who wrote Princess Bride, is another writer that we recently lost who, just had that innate ability to just tell a good story. Mm-hmm. And that's a rare thing. And if you don't have that innate ability, you have to learn the craft, and then you can let it go. Mm-hmm. But, Being John, if someone, and this actually changed my teaching, because if someone had come to me and said, told me the plot of Being John Malkovich and said they were going to write that script, when I first started teaching, I would have said, oh, no, don't do that film. Nobody's going to want to see that film. Yeah. What are you talking about? Somebody crawls through a tunnel into John Malkovich's head and use him as a puppet? What? Mm-hmm. So yeah. But after the film and seeing it and really enjoying that movie, I went, I don't know everything. I don't know what people are going to react to and like. Mm-hmm. I think I know what most people like, but I could be wrong. And so I never try to force a writer to get off of their story. What I try to help writers do is find the best story that they can, their story, whatever that is. Mm-hmm. Make it the best it can. Meaning, how do you turn up the amp? How do you make it go to 12? How do you keep the characters engaged and the audience interested?
So, touching on structure again, mm-hmm. or the parts of the structure, where do you see people having those problems as far as transitioning from the middle to the end?
Where do I see them having problems?
Yeah, where do they have? Where people might have a muddled structure development. It really kind of, the one thing about screenwriting is it's all part of a very tight weave. Mm-hmm. So it really goes back to what does the character want and what are they going after? Mm-hmm. So, you talked about comedy. One of my favorite comedies was a movie called There's Something About Mary. Mm-hmm. And do you know the film? I do. Yes. Okay. Very well.
There's something, very, very funny film. And, that story could not be clearer. It's a guy who had a high school sweetheart that he kind of never got to take to the prom because of a horrendous accident. Mm-hmm. She had just broken up with her boyfriend, Woogie. And now, 20 years later, he's still obsessing over this girl he knew in high school. And he decides to see if he can find her. So he hires a private detective. Mm-hmm. And the thing about Mary is everybody who meets her falls in love with her. Mm-hmm. So the detective goes down, falls in love with her, and decides not to tell Ben Stiller's character that she's, okay and fabulous and a sports doctor and all of this other, stuff. So mm-hmm. he lies to him and says she's, obese and has, 12 kids and is not married and living on welfare. And in spite of that, because of his obsession and because he truly loves her, he decides he's still going to go for it. And he goes on this journey. Mm-hmm. And it's absolutely the structure we've talked about where he's got a clear goal. Mm-hmm. And then at some point, when we get to the battle, everything is converging. And in this case, it's the 4 men that are in love with Mary, mm-hmm. 5 if you count the one very end, when they all converge, it's him who has this revelation that if he really truly loves her, he wants to do what's going to make her happy, even if it makes him miserable. And he makes that choice. And because it's a comedy and because it's a feel-good movie, when he makes that choice to give her up to the man that really she should be with, she realizes that he's the guy for her. So it's a win-win on that, in that case. But he has made the choice to give up what he wants in order to get what he needs, which is, I have to do what is best for true love.
And the interesting thing there is that, with various sort of character plot lines, they all reinforce each other. It's almost like a spectrum of creepiness, amongst all these guys. Yeah,
exactly. And that's going back to what I was talking about, thematic resonance, where you want to have a story. If your story is about love, you may have a subplot that's about hate. So, a film where, it's a love story, but there's an ex-boyfriend who's a stalker who, is going to make their lives living hell. There's the love story, and then there's the hate story. So you have these B storylines, A storylines. They either support or they refute your basic premise, your argument for your story. Here's what I want people to understand. True love conquers all. And, that's a cliche. So you want to find something a little more interesting than that. But for illustration purposes, you want to have that as your kind of theme that presses and pushes against something. There was a movie years ago called Dead Man Walking. And it became really iconic, mainly for that phrase. But it was a film that did a really well-balanced investigation of the death penalty and whether or not, putting people to death for killing people made sense. And it follows the story of a nun who is, serving on death row, and an inmate who swears he's innocent up and down. And everybody, she talks to all the people around him, the people that lost loved ones because, they said that he killed them, and on and on. And eventually she has to say goodbye to this guy. He's going to go to the gas chamber. So, but it really looked at it from both sides. And it looked at it so that the audience walked out of that film going, well, I have to rethink what I feel about the death penalty, regardless of which side you were on. If you walked in going, I believe in the death penalty, I believe there are people that no longer need to be on this earth, or I think that killing is wrong, and if killing is wrong, it's wrong to kill this person. You could see both sides. So the premise, which is again not just the log line, but the theme, the is the undercurrent of your story, is something that is going to be the argument that pushes throughout the whole movie. It's the one thing that the characters can't get away from.
So, what about this particular idea? And I forget where I've read it, that the ending of the movie should not surprise you. Like, it could surprise you, but what you're presented at the beginning, when you get to the end, you should think to yourself, yeah, that makes total sense, that it developed and completed in this way.
Yeah, I don't agree with that 100%. My philosophy is you want to motivate the arbitrary. So, and I'll give you an example, a bad example and a good example. There was in one movie called Perfect Strangers that Halle Berry and Bruce Willis were in. The movie goes, through all kinds of machinations and ends up that, you think that Bruce Willis is this killer, then you think it's her best friend that is obsessed with her and is a killer, and then at the very end, suddenly it's her. She's the one who's the killer. And you walk out of that movie going, what the hell was that? And I talked to the filmmakers. They came and spoke to my class. And I talked to Halle Berry. And one of the things that they talked about is she came on as an actress and had a hand in the script. And I'm not I'm not denigrating her writing ability or anything else, but she said, we went through 27 drafts to find this ending. And she liked that ending because it was a dramatic turn for that actor. But it was so unmotivated and came so far out of left field that the audience went, come on. Are you kidding me? Really? So, at least in my opinion. And it was not a popular film. It had a great cast. Giovanni Ribisi was one of the people in it. Bruce Willis, Halle Berry, and this was when she was at the top of her form. And Bruce Willis hadn't yet decided to do every film that came along. So these were top actors, but it just didn't work. On the other hand, there's a movie called Unfaithful with Diane Lane, and Richard Gere plays her husband in it, and she's having an affair, and he is just the best, most reasonable, loving husband you can imagine. He's just kind of like a really good guy, but he's a little bit cool, and she wants passion in her life. So she starts having an affair with this young guy. And eventually he finds out, and he goes to have a conversation and talk to this guy. And as he's talking to him, he sees the snow globe that his wife had bought as a present for this guy. And he picks it up and he smashes this guy's head in, kills him. And it's a shocking moment. It is an unexpected moment, but it's absolutely believable. You walk out going, yeah, I can see being in that position where I'm so hurt and angry by the actions of my wife that I snap and do something irrational. So I talk about that motivating, like I said, motivating the arbitrary. You can do something arbitrary. You can have, elephants show up, in your bathtub, if you can figure out a way that makes sense and that it's real, and that you go, okay, in this universe, elephants show up in the bathroom and there's a reason for it, and this is why and how. And if you understand that and the audience buys it, you can do that. And you can do that with the end of a movie as well. And I'm trying to think I've seen a couple of things recently where the end you go, oh, wow, okay, I didn't see that coming. And that's not a bad way to end a film if you adhere to this concept of the audience wants to have that moment of kind of this revelation where they go, oh, it's that guy. They kind of go back in their mind. They go back in their memory, and they start to track the breadcrumbs that were left behind. I think enough people have seen The Sixth Sense that I can ruin that film for people. Would you agree?
Yeah. I'll just say spoiler for Sixth Sense.
Yeah. So The Sixth Sense is another great example. Terrific storyline, terrific characters. It's a doctor who's had this traumatic experience with one of his patients, and he then is trying to save this young boy who claims to be able to see dead people. And it's really about his desire not only to do that, but also to let go of his past. And those are intimately tied together. And of course, we go through this entire film where he's, trying to determine whether or not he believes this kid. And the kid eventually convinces him. And then the kid says something to him, and he actually runs back through all the moments in the movie where he's with his wife and doing different things, and realizes that he wasn't there because he's dead. He's also a ghost. And that moment when you saw the film, was absolutely unexpected and shocking. But as you go back through and you go, oh, when she put her wedding ring on the table, she was just saying, I've got to move on. He wasn't there, and she was just kind of talking to herself. And when he was saying to her, why don't you don't want to talk to me? Okay, fine, I'm going to go. It was because he's not there. And, it was a poltergeist thing when he broke a window, and, all these different moments that you start to realize, oh, snap, he wasn't really there.
Yeah.
It's his spirit that was there. And then he gets to take that moment and, be at rest. So that was a shocking thing. And of course, that M. Night has a history of doing those kind of turns in films, and sometimes he does it more successfully than other. Mm-hmm. I think one he did, I think, was called The Event, maybe.
I don't recall that.
Yeah, I think it was called The Event. Not so successful. Not so good. And it's got, again, good cast. Mm-hmm. But the story is there is a virus that's making people suicidal maniacs. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a zombie movie. Okay. But it turns out that it's spores that are carried on the wind. And at some point, scenes there are many scenes where the wind is coming and they have to try and sprint away from the wind. And it gets to a place where it's kind of comedic that, they're trying to outrun the wind. Yeah. And, it's like, okay. And then eventually I think people get used to the spores and that's it. Yeah. Or they find some way to kill it. But it was a little bit of nonsense. But he likes that, that turn. So I don't know that I agree with the idea of you don't want it to be a shock. You don't want it to be, but I do think you want it to be believable. Right. So whatever choice you make, whatever turn you do, you don't want the audience to leave going, that would never happen. Mm-hmm. I don't believe that.
Do you think you have to establish that in the beginning, like connect with that ending some way in the beginning, or can you introduce and develop it in the middle?
Well, generally speaking, depending on how you structure it mm-hmm. and how you move through space and time, it really depends. But whatever it is, it can be the moment before the final moment. If you motivate it in a way that you go, oh, okay. I mean, for instance, going back to Unfaithful, there's no hint of violence in this man. Hmm. There's no hint that he would be capable of killing somebody. There's none. And yet, when we get to that point, I think anyone who's been in a relationship will go, okay, I can see that. Mm-hmm. He snapped. He just snapped. Mm-hmm. And made a snap, moment decision that was costly for him and this guy, mm-hmm. and then didn't know what else to do. So those moments, as long, and I guess you could say, well, it's built up because we see in the beginning his deep love for his wife, mm-hmm. his family, and his concern over what's going on. So I think, as you start to track that, that builds this idea that he's under pressure and he's becoming, more and more suspicious. Mm-hmm. And as he becomes more suspicious, the pressure is rising on him. It's not really his story. Mm-hmm. It's not his story at all, really. It's her story. But it becomes his story and it becomes his kind of finale when he kills this guy. That's really the truth. You don't have to set up in the beginning, but you have to have. And by setup, it just has to be believable. And again, they don't really, if they had him be murderous in the first scene, or you saw anger in the first scene, you certainly wouldn't have the shock at the end. But it also wouldn't have the effect. You wouldn't feel like, that moment stood out in your mind as something that was kind of exceptional. Mm-hmm. And it was an exceptional ending. So, those things are always something you want to kind of look at. I'll give you another, I think, great example was the recent Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, which was, another Tarantino film where, and this is another thing Tarantino does, and he's done it now a few times, where he revises history. Mm-hmm. And, he did it with Inglorious Bastards, where, the way that film ends is we kill every head of the Nazi party in one fell swoop in a theater, and the war ends. Yeah. And I don't remember it happening like that.
Right.
I don't think that's how it went down. Yeah. So, he made that choice to kind of like flip that switch because, it was interesting. It was provocative, but here's what it was. And this goes back to what we were saying earlier. We would all love to see that, wouldn't we? Mm-hmm. Wouldn't we love to have, the ability to just wipe out the Nazis in one fell swoop.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be just grand? And he did the same thing in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. And again, I don't want to do it. This is a spoiler, and it's a recent enough film. I don't want to, spoil the ending, but he revises history. And for those of us who lived through that time in the 70s, when the Tate LoBianco murders happened and Charlie Manson's family was still alive, that was a traumatic event in our country. It was a traumatic event in our history. And it was one of the greatest evils in our storied past of great evils. So, and his playing with that had that same effect where you go, God, I wish that's how it had gone down. I wish we could have done it that way, So that's how I think, you look at those kind of endings and go, as long as the audience leaves going, I can fully believe that character would do it. And leaves going, wow, I wish it had happened like that. Wouldn't that have been great? I wish, I wish that Tony Stark could just snap his fingers and the world will go back to what it was. Those are the things that we fantasize about, and we want that ending. If Thanos had won at the end of, the final Marvel movie, we would not have been satisfied.
Yeah.
we would have been pissed off, right?
Yeah.
And we want our heroes to struggle mightily. We want them to be, up against what appear to be insurmountable odds, and then to overcome those insurmountable odds. Yeah. But it has to be done with, some tact and some guile and some skill.
So, just for the sake of time, we'll need to wrap this up. But are there any other last points you want to make about structure?
Yeah, I think structure is something that is crucially important for writing screenplays. But it's also something that, again, once you have that understanding of what structure is, you can follow structure, and you understand how stories move through space and time, you have every right to, and should if you want to, play with the form. And, you can take stories, Memento went instead of beginning, middle, and end, went end, middle, beginning. Still had an end, middle, beginning, but it flipped it. Tarantino plays with story that way. There are other people that have tried it and have, some more successful than others. And it's not just time and space. If you find something unique about the way you want to tell a story, as long as you walk away going, this is the story I wanted to tell the way I wanted to tell it, and people can get what you're going for, then I think you're in solid territory. And, I go back to what Stephen King once said about, a writer writes something in the present and projects it into the future, and somewhere in the future somebody receives that information and builds exactly the story and exactly the image that you projected from the past. So it's the same thing here. If you've got this feeling, this idea, this concept, and you want people to feel it like you do, and you succeed at that, and you found some different way of approaching it, more power to you. Those are the people that aim for the corners and hit the home run, right down the third base line. And it's, people that can, pull their swings. They're the ones that are getting 50 and 60 home runs a year. That's great. If you're one of those people, if you're Tarantino, if you're, to a lesser degree, Spike Lee, if you're one of those guys, Tim Burton, another guy, yeah, go for it. But no structure. Learn it. Don't pretend like it's not important. Learn it. Learn it. And then once you've learned it, let it go and do what you want to do. But at least then you'll have the foundation. So you'll know that if you start to wander, you can go, okay, I know how to get back to this spot. And that's actually, if we'll do this next time when we talk about outline, but once you understand what your structure is going to be, which is basically your beginning, middle, and end, then you start to expand it eventually into your outline. And I have a method that I use and that I suggest people use, and it's not not something that they have to do. There's no formula. You You don't have to follow it. It's just a suggestion of how you can start to put down markers that allow you to go from A to B to C, all the way to Z, and not lose your way. Because oftentimes, writers will start to write something, and halfway through they go, I have no idea who these characters are, where they're going, what they're supposed to do, or how I'm going to end this thing. And, early in my career, I wrote a script that I got 70 pages into and went, I give up. Can't do it. Don't know what I was thinking. And, I thought it was going to be the next, just brilliant movie. I pitched it as a cross between Pumping Iron and Saturday Night Fever. And that's what it was. And about 70 pages in, I went, what? Because I let it just wander. An idea would come to me, I would go there, and I painted myself into a corner. And that was actually my motivation to start studying screenwriting. I'd already written a screenplay, but the first screenplay I wrote, it was option. The story was something that came from my life, and it had that very strong beginning, middle, and end, because I knew that story. And then I took something where I was just going to kind of wing it. The first script I wrote in 5 days initially, rewrote over several years, but wrote in 5 days. The second one, 70 pages in, 2 months later, I went, done, start over. So then I went and started taking classes, reading books, studying Sid Field and Joseph Campbell and Robert McKee, and going to those classes and trying to learn Linda Seeger, just different people that were kind of the go-to mentors of the day, and try to learn, what is it that makes a good film, and what is it that makes a good story, and then how do you take that and apply it to what you want to do and what you want to say. And the one thing I don't believe in, although there is a strong argument to have it, that a lot of people, Blake Snyder wrote a book called Save the Cat, and there are some really nice elements in it, but I'm not a big fan of the book. And one of the reasons I'm not a big fan of the book is because it starts to break down structure, like we do something on page 3, page 7, page 9, page 15, and it so micromanages it that my feeling is if you follow that rule, follow that book, you end up with a cookie cutter and a film that's just the same film as, everybody else. So I think you want to look at structure as something that's fluid. Don't worry about if my, act break, my character starting his hero's journey doesn't happen between page 25 and page 30. If it happens on page 20, don't have a conniption. You'll be fine. If it happens on page 40, that's a little late, but it's all right. Life will go on. It won't stop. So it's more important, are you telling the story you want to tell? Are you telling it the way you want to tell it? And are you going to keep your audience that you are targeting engaged? And again, that goes back to this idea that not every film is for everybody.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm looking forward. That's
my last word on it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to outlining. So yeah. So thanks. Right. Thanks very much again for speaking with me.
Thank you, Cris. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you for listening. If you like this podcast, Full Contact Nerd, please subscribe and rate it if you can. If you want more fiction and fiction studies ranging from ancient mythology to modern-day sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, please sign up for my weekly newsletter at fullcontactnerd.com or chrisalvarez.com to keep up with my latest posts. On my webpage, you'll also find written interviews and links to my social media accounts on YouTube, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. I also discuss art, acting, comic books, gaming, and much more. Thanks again, and keep imagining the past, the present, and the future.